Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. It's a baseball week around here, full term, and our wise conversations continue. But football news, there were a lot of disgruntled people. Luke Jones, wide receiver, give me Allen Robinson, give me Marvin Jones, give me anybody, give me somebody I've never heard of. We've all heard of Sammy Watkins. Now, I don't know how this is going to turn out. It certainly isn't a big money move. I'll just put it to you and leave it to you this far. He's the savior now, right? For 5 minutes, right? He's the guy. He's the answer. He's probably not the savior. That's probably the truth here. If he were the savior, he'd be more expensive. That being said, I'll check off on this, but I don't think it makes them the Super Bowl winner next year, but I don't know that I felt that way about Anquan Boldin that day. I was rolling around Phoenix and got that text from you on the Coons 4 WNST text service, right?
Yeah, I'll say this. If you're trying to talk yourself into Sammy Watkins being a savior, I'd say you're a Ravens fan who's been down this road way too many times to be thinking like that. Let's just call a spade a spade. There's a reason why Sammy Watkins was available for 1 year, $5 million guaranteed. Do I think he can help? Yes. Do I think he can be part of the answer? Sure. Do I think this is going to be more like Derek Mason, Anquan Boldin, or more like Jeremy Maclin, Michael Crabtree? If you make me guess one or the other, I'm probably going to say the latter based on just the sheer lack of availability in the career of Sammy Watkins.
By the way, would you give Mike Wallace somewhere in the middle? I'm trying to figure out what the middle is. Where's a guy you could sign that's not Macklin or Leon Searcy? You know what I mean? Somebody that actually got on the field and played who was signed. I don't know who. I'll give you one. My good friend on Twitter, Owen Daniel. He was a good signing. At that point, decent for the time. End of his career, played okay in maybe a winning role, but wasn't the star performer, but was a nice complimentary piece. Hollywood Brown better be your star, dude. You drafted him. No offense. He better outcatch Sammy Watkins. He better.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating you bring that up. I was actually hoping we'd get into just this kind of bigger picture discussion. Look, to be very clear, if Sammy Watkins is healthy, yes, he can help this team. I don't think he's washed up. I don't think he's someone who can't play.
He's 28, right? He's young.
Well, he's 28, but
younger than Trey Mancini. I learned that from Luke Jones.
That's true. But he does have a long injury history, and foot, calf, hamstring issues, a lot of soft tissue issues. I do think the foot history is something to keep in mind from a big picture standpoint, not necessarily saying 2000.
Jimmy Smith in that way?
Right. Sure. I just think there's a lot of wear and tear there to deal with.
The ceiling's no longer a number 4 overall is what you're telling me.
Sure. Exactly. The reality is he's played more than 10 games in a season just twice in the last 5 years.
During his prime.
Yeah, we lament about Jimmy Smith's lack of availability. This guy's had bigger issues than Jimmy Smith over the last 5 years in that way. So that being said, I'm so glad you brought up Marquise Brown, because to me, and we've had this discussion in varying forms, but I think with what's happened over the last week plus, trying to get Juju Smith-Schuster, offering about $1 million more than the Steelers, more if you count incentives, but he goes back to Pittsburgh, higher volume passing attack. Knowing the market's down, it's a 1-year deal, pillow contract scenario. The Ravens aren't a destination if that's what you're looking for. T.Y. Hilton, the Ravens did offer a 3-year deal. He stayed on a 1-year deal with Indianapolis.
Let's be honest. If you're one of these dudes, you want to play on a team that sucks like Vinny Testaverde in '96, where you're going to get the ball. You might win, you might not, but you're going to get paid when the contract happens next year because you're going to get 90 balls this year.
Well, I think guys want to win, but they want to win in the process of catching 90 passes.
They can talk themselves into thinking the Browns are going to win.
Well, but let's be clear here. The Ravens are the exception. The Ravens are the outlier here. Everyone throws the ball now. That's just the truth. Now, okay, as we talked with Aaron Schatz from Football Outsiders the week of the Super Bowl, the Patriots tried to play like the Ravens this past year.
Well, there's Navy. There's always Navy.
Oh, yeah. There's Navy, sure, of course. But the point is, these receivers, they're having to make a conscious decision that, are you going to go to Baltimore where Part of the issue is the Ravens don't overpay. Am I saying they should overpay? Well, the proof is going to be in the pudding. If they're falling short in the divisional round again, then you make more of an argument that you go pay Corey Davis and pay him more than the New York Jets, or go pay Marvin Jones more than the Jacksonville Jaguars did. But the point is, there's a challenge there. It's a low volume passing attack. People can paint it however they want. The biggest cynics will say, "Oh, Lamar Jackson, he's not good enough." Blah blah blah. The truth is in the narrative that, for whatever reason, whether it's Greg Roman, whether it's just the sheer volume, whether it's Lamar Jackson, whether it's hearing guys like Des Bryant and Willie Snead say things that haven't been so flattering on Twitter, whether it was veiled, whether it was kind of a general statement, or just speaking the truth, that's all there. So you do have this offense that, let's face it, if
Willie Snead doesn't know if they threw the ball 50 times a game, they couldn't run it 50 times a game, right? Like,
well, I mean, look, I don't think
they won a lot of ball games the way they played. So, like, for Willie Snead or Des Bryant to be snippy, I take that with the same grain of less than salt that I take flour that I would take with Bernard Pollard at this point, right?
I mean, I don't care what Des Bryant has to say. What Willie Snead said, and again, when I mentioned this, I don't even think it. Go back and look at the tweets. It was more so talking about this talk of the Ravens needing a, quote, number one wide receiver, and he was alluding to the fact that anyone can be a, quote, number one wide receiver if they're getting a lot of targets, if they're having a lot of passes thrown their way. Go back to the 2013 season. The Ravens offense was crap that year. I mean, it just wasn't good. Torrey Smith had his only 1,000-yard season that year. Why? Because he got more volume, because Anquan Bolden was gone and the Ravens never replaced him. So Torrey Smith didn't become a number one wide receiver that year, but he had a better statistical season. Why? He had more passes being thrown his way.
And he got paid on a team that didn't win at all.
Sure. But my the point that I was trying to make is this is a low volume passing game. We know that. That's probably not going to change. Do they throw the ball a little bit more in 2021? Do they throw the ball a little bit more in 2023? Sure. I'll buy that. But is it going to be going from last in the league in passing yards per game to suddenly 10th? No, it's not going to be that. It wasn't that in 2019 when their efficiency numbers in the passing game were through the roof. So you're constantly, it's kind of this uphill battle where it's not an attractive destination for wide receivers who either are worried about it from a business standpoint or they just want to be involved. There's also something to be said that, all right, yes, I can go to Baltimore and win, or I could go to this other contender and probably have as good of a chance or close to the same chance of winning, and I'm going to catch 25 more passes and have a chance to be an 1,100-yard receiver, where that's probably not the case in Baltimore. So there's that. And then going back to what a point I kind of sort of made, the Ravens do not have a history, I guess, other than the Washington wide receiver Ryan Grant that they inexplicably gave a big contract to, and then found out his ankle wasn't 100%. I mean, talk about a blessing in disguise there, because I still don't understand that. That's one I'll never understand. I digress. They typically have not paid wide receivers and overpaid wide receivers, maybe in the way that you could argue they overpaid Brandon Williams a little bit at the time, but they valued him, right? They wanted to keep him in Baltimore, and they valued that position. They went out and did it. They went out and paid Tony Jefferson huge money on the open market. They haven't done that with a wide receiver in a really long time. You have to go back to when they traded and then extended Anquan Bolden, or go back to Derek Mason in 2005, giving him what was big money for a wide receiver at the time. It just hasn't been in their DNA even before the Lamar Jackson era. So you kind of have those two qualities kind of converging where you have this issue. So you mentioned Marquise Brown, and this is, I don't know if I'd call it an epiphany, but I've just been giving it a lot of thought because, my goodness, we've been asked about wide receivers over and over and over the last 2 weeks. And then the end of the second week of free agency, they do sign Sammy Watkins. This narrative in the big picture, narrative, dilemma, conundrum, however you want to describe it, where the Ravens are right now. I think Marquise Brown is such a pivotal force in this whole discussion for 2021 and in the big picture as far as this offense, its viability in terms of wanting to get better as a passing game, with the presumption that you're going to need to be able to do that more in January, as the Ravens have found out the last couple years. If Marquise Brown can build on what he did at the end of last season, and Blossom take another step forward. I mean, last season he was right around. He was 769 receiving yards on 58 catches, caught 8 touchdowns. Can he blossom into a guy that is in that 950, maybe in his best season, 1,000-yard kind of receiver? You know, we're not talking about insane numbers here. We're talking about good numbers.
80 catches?
If he
got 60 last year. What do you, I mean?
But he had 50. He had 58. I mean, can he get into? Say
And he dropped 10.
70 and 9.
Maybe drop more than 10.
And if you can recall, there were some deep shots that Lamar Jackson missed an open Marquise Brown as well. So it's not just. My point is, if he can take a step forward, kind of become that wide receiver in this offense, knowing that you're not going to have a 1,500-yard receiver in this offense. If he can be a 950, 1,000-yard-ish kind of wide receiver, and the Ravens can extend him. Keep in mind, this is a guy who's he has a friendship with Lamar Jackson. So there's a relationship there. These guys hang out away from football. If they can have him continue to take another step forward in 2021, and you can extend him, to me, you can chip away at that narrative a little bit more where you say, okay, this is a guy that was drafted. His numbers improved every year, and we got him to buy in enough. And to be clear, you're not lowballing him on an extension. You're giving him, he's a 950-yard receiver in this offense. You pay him like, I don't know, an 1,100-yard receiver in a vacuum for some other, quote, normal offense. If you can do that, I think you can chip away, and maybe that helps you down the road, that if you need to go out and get another veteran wide receiver, that maybe you can do better than Sammy Watkins. The other alternative to that is, okay, you go out and draft this year's version of Justin Jefferson, and he's a star from day one, and you have your number one wide receiver. And to be clear, signing Sammy Watkins, I don't think should change their approach to the draft and looking at wide receivers in this draft class whatsoever. I mean, he's on a 1-year deal. He's an injury-prone 28-year-old wide receiver who hasn't put up much. And by the way, was playing in a very high volume passing attack in Kansas City. Let's keep that in mind as well. I think going back to Marquise Brown, though, the alternative is he doesn't take a major step forward statistically in year 3, or, stretch it out to year 4, or he does, but come free agency, come contract extension talks, he says, you know what? I can be more than this. I want to be more than this. I think I can be Tyreek Hill if I go to the San Francisco 49ers, or, take your pick, the Miami Dolphins, whoever.
Whatever offense would give him the ball 14 times a game.
If you can't sell him being a homegrown drafted wide receiver who to this point has had some modest success, he hasn't been a bust. Would I say he's been a slam dunk success, first round pick success story for the Ravens? No, not yet.
But in this offense, he caught 60. How many?
Well,
where is the improvement, and how does Sammy Watkins affect that? How does Mark Andrews affect that? How does Kevin Zeitler affect? How does protection affect that? How does it affect that when Lamar's not running 15 or 18 times a game and is only running 8 or 10 times a game, and those other 6 plays are 4 chances for Hollywood or 4 chances for Sammy Watkins? I don't know who it is, but there's only so many plays in a football game when you go up and down the field, the way they do, and utilizing the clock the way they, they're just never going to run 100 plays. They're not, right? I mean, when you run the clock. That's the other thing you do, so you don't extend the game.
Sure, but I mean, going back to my point about Marquise Brown, I just feel like he's going to be the ultimate case study here, because if he takes another step forward, I'm not saying he's going to be a Pro Bowl wide receiver, but a very clear number one for what the Ravens have here, right? I mean, he takes that step, and maybe he's not a 1,000-yard receiver, but 950 and catches 9 or 10 touchdowns. He's very clearly defined as the guy of their wide receiver room. And to the point where the Ravens make it clear they want to keep him. If they are then unsuccessful in being able to keep him because he doesn't want to be here anymore, because he wants to branch out and put up big numbers, and let's say they offer market, not lowballing him or anything like that. If you can't keep him, then that's when I really become concerned about this thing in a big picture sense. In the case of, even if you draft a guy and he's friends with Lamar and he's got a rapport with Lamar and he hangs out with him away from football and he still wants to leave, then that's where you look at this thing and you say,
we're never going to get a wide receiver who can get the ball enough.
Right. Well, and
you want to be here.
And even if you draft that guy, he doesn't want to stay. So it's going to be this constant cycle. So, and again, I'm putting the cart before the horse a little bit there. I mean, that's still, he's another season beyond this one. Keep in mind, 5th-year option, that'll be a decision they have to make, a year from now as well. But
that is also how Watkins affects this, right? Because this weekend, everybody's, it's a savior. You and I know better than that.
I don't think many Ravens fans are saying that, though.
But I think people are happy they signed him, that they signed somebody with a heart.
I think they're relieved more than anything. I think it's more relieved.
Okay, so what does relieved mean? What? And this is where the whole thing was going to begin. And I'm glad you went into a Hollywood dissertation. I really am. I mean, it's fine. But okay, they signed this guy. What's the expectation other than we're going to win the Super Bowl because we signed him, right? What's the expectation in this offense? Not the Anquan Bolden signing in the Joe Flacco offense. Yeah. In this offense, what did Eric and John and Greg Roan, what did they literally sit out last week and tell him? What did they say to him? This is how this is going to work. This is how you're going to get a 3-year extension here next year when we win the Super Bowl because you're here now. And here's what we're going to do with Hollywood. Here's what we're going to do with Mark. Here's what we're going to do with the offense. Here's what we're going to do with Lamar. Here's what we're going to use Gus. We're going to use this kid from Ohio State. Don't know if you see him play. Right? I mean, that's what they're going to talk about because that's what they do talk about. Sammy Watkins doesn't talk about nightclubs when he's coming here or girls or where to get a crab cake. I talk about that. But literally, what they sit and talk about when you're on your third team, right? You know what I mean? Is, all right, can I win? I know I can win here. It's Baltimore. That's why I'm in the, I'm in the building. Now, how do I fit into this? Where do I get to hold the trophy and sing 2 Tickets to Paradise next year here? How do we get to do that, and what's my role? And that's what his agent wants, and that's what he wants to know. So make that case for me. What's the ceiling? How does this work for Sammy Watkins?
Well, I mean, you have to start with he's got to be able to stay on the field, and that's where you look at Steve Saunders. COVID suspension and that part of the discussion aside, he's been here for 5 years. Catastrophic injuries that you can't prevent, like Nick Boyle or Ronnie Stanley aside, they have been better. If you look at it statistically with Football Outsiders, they look at adjusted games lost. They kind of track it across the league. The last 5 years since Steve Saunders arrived, lots of players have talked about it as well. John Harbaugh's talked about it as well. They have had fewer soft tissue type hamstring, calves. I mean, that's not to say they don't still have them, but you hope, first of all, if I'm the Ravens, that had to come up, right? I mean, it has to come up when you're talking about a guy who, the last 5 years has played 8, 15, 10, 14, and 10 games. I mean, he's missed a lot of football over the last 5 years. He knows the volume's not going to be there for him. It wasn't there for him very often in Kansas City, other than stretches of time over the last 3 years. Why? Because they had Travis Kelce and they had Tyreek Hill and they had McCole Hardman and Robinson, and go down the list of all the different guys they had that, when he misses time, someone steps up and you kind of fall to the wayside there. I think for Sammy Watkins, how he fits, first of all, he's 6'1". He does have a little bit of size. Is he a monster? No, but he is a 6'1" guy. Has shown an ability for a guy his size to be able to high point the ball, make some contested catches. He can play on the outside. One thing I've talked about a lot with you is the Ravens have an abundance of slot type wide receivers. Willie Snead was that. That's why they didn't try to bring him back, because they drafted Devin Duvernay and James Prochet, who are both slot guys. Mark Andrews, yes, he's a tight end, but he lines up in the slot a whole lot. Marquise Brown has lined up in the slot has probably done some of his better work from there, although they need him to play on the outside. They needed an X-type wide receiver who could play on the outside. I think he fits that profile. He's played in the slot and outside Has mixed that up a lot based on what Kansas City or the Rams or the Bills needed at various points in his career. So he's able to do that. He is someone who, the last couple years, because Tyreek Hill has dominated the deep targets in Kansas City, became a little bit more of an intermediate guy. I think it's tough to gauge if he, I'm not going to sit here and say if he's healthy, he can't stretch the field anymore, but he did become a little bit more of an intermediate, over the middle, crossing route, comeback route kind of guy, which is something that Lamar Jackson does well with. So, as far as types of throws that he makes successfully. So I think, to try to put a number on it, I mean, we're talking about a wide receiver who hasn't posted more than 673 receiving yards in a season since his second season, 2015. So the injuries alone have been, an issue in that regard.
Projecting him at 1,000 yards in this offense is crazy.
Right, exactly. And I think even expecting 800 yards would be crazy, just based on, one, this offense, two, his lack of availability. I think, you kind of look at what he did in Kansas City 2 years ago, where he played 14 games, he had 673 yards. If he could be somewhere in that ballpark, then great. That sounds promising. You'd basically like him to be more than what Willie Snead was statistically, right? If you're on a real simplistic level, he's going to cut into not so much Snead because it's, that's slot compared to outside, but presumably he's going to cut into some of Miles Boykin's playing time. And we know Boykin has been, more of a blocking guy, and, he'll get one ball thrown his way and might take it for a touchdown. That's kind of been what his role has been in this offense. So it's tough to really nail down a projection, because he's had such difficulty staying on the field. And at age 28, that doesn't figure to get dramatically better. You're hoping it can be a little bit better. You're hoping maybe their heralded training program can maybe do some different things for him and help him out in that way. But, I think, again, I'll go back to, I think he can help them. I'll also point out he's someone who does have a reputation for being a pretty good blocker. I don't think that's the main reason why the Ravens acquired him, because Miles Boykin does a good job in that regard, but it's a plus because he's going to be on the field when they're running the ball. He's going to be on the field a lot in those.
I would say it's a plus. I'd say it's mandatory, right?
It's my point is, they didn't go out of their way just to sign another blocking, a receiver who blocks well, because if that's all they cared about, then they'd be fine with Miles Boykin. They wanted someone who can catch the ball and do some more things for them in that way. But it certainly helps. It's, again, I think he can help, but I look at the number of games missed, and knowing that typically doesn't get better as you age. And I understand he's only going to be 28 this fall, so I'm not saying that he's washed or he can't help them, but I think just the low volume of this offense in general, and then understanding, where he is in his career with the injuries. And also, as I mentioned, I don't want this to the worst thing the Ravens could do, and I don't think they feel this way whatsoever. And I think the proof would be in look at the receivers they have drafted the last couple of years. I think you've seen, say what you want about them on the free agent market, they have drafted more wide receivers the last couple of years. They have. Just look at the numbers. They've drafted 2 wide receivers each.
They're trying.
In the last 2 drafts. And yeah, I won't go as far back to 2018, because Jaleel Scott and Jordan Lastly were day 3 guys. I want to at least be talking about day 1 and day 2 guys, first through third round. And they've drafted 3 wide receivers in the first 3 rounds over the last 2 years. So, assuming they are still looking at the wide receiver position going into the draft as a big priority, if not the first round, certainly the second round, certainly the third round. Those first 2 days of the draft, they come away with a guy in addition to signing Sammy Watkins, and great. And we'll see how that falls. We'll see if it's a first round guy and it's Terrace Marshall from LSU, who a lot of people have mocked to them. I know Mel Kiper's talked about that. Rashad Bateman from Minnesota, 6'2". This is a wide receiver class that's heralded. It's being praised. Some people have said it's better than last year's class, which there was a lot of hype surrounding. So, however, if you sign Sammy Watkins and you strike out in the first 3 rounds of the draft and you're waiting until day 3 to add a wide receiver, that's when guys like me are going to be way more skeptical and doubting this thing much more.
Well, they talked about making the room better, right? So you know, and it's a full on. And I put the tight ends in there. I've said that all along. The tight ends are also part of that conversation to me, whomever they are.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's something you and I've talked about going back to last March when they traded Hayden Hurst, which, look, in hindsight, they netted J.K. Dobbins with that draft pick, and Hayden Hurst wanted to be traded. And, the Ravens were willing to accommodate. That was something, though, that changed the identity of what they did really, really well in 2019. And that's where I'd also like to see them take a long look at wide receiver or tight end possibilities, I should say, because to your point, that's something that could really matter. If you could find another tight end to kind of match with Mark Andrews, that you could have those two guys on the field, and taking nothing away from Nick Boyle, but he's more of a blocker. He'd be the first to tell you that. He's a blocking tight end. He can catch a few balls here and there, but that's not his forte. That's not what he's best at doing. But if you could add another guy that can be a viable piece that you can line up in some two tight sets with Mark Andrews and kind of recapture some of those Hayden Hurst, Mark Andrews dynamics that you had 2 years ago, boy, you're diversifying your passing game a little bit more. You're evolving, or at least getting back to some of the things you were able to do 2 years ago that you couldn't do quite as well last year. So that's definitely part of it. I agree with you 100% in that regard. And, they added the kid from Jacksonville, traded a conditional 7th round pick for him, a former 3rd round pick. So, he's a guy, right now until he proves otherwise, but clearly someone that has some athleticism. So we'll see. Again, if we fast forward to July and August, and the only meaningful addition they've made at wide receiver is Sammy Watkins, then I'm going to tell you, I think this is a very disappointing offseason in that way. That's not enough in it by itself. However, you draft a wide receiver as well, use a meaningful draft pick there. And in addition to Sammy Watkins,
and get a guy you want, get a guy you know that this is what Duvernay's supposed to be. It's what Hollywood. They're supposed to be guys you wanted. Not Sammy Watkins, which is what you can get, not what you want. Right?
It was your plan, at least plan C, and that's that's discounting anyone else they may have been in on that they were able to.
May have loved Allen Robinson. Who knows?
Right.
But
yeah. So again, I don't want to be disingenuous here. I'm not excited about Sammy Watkins. I'm just not because of the injury history.
But you would have been more excited about Juju Smith-Schuster.
Yeah, because he's a better player. Although Juju Smith-Schuster's played at his best in the slot. He struggled on the outside after Antonio Brown moved on. And in fact, he played more in the back. He was back more in the slot this past year with Pittsburgh. So, again,
because that's what coaches do. They use guys in the way they can be successful.
Right. And and let's be very clear. And I say this all the time. There isn't one perfect off season. I always think of an off season as like in elementary school. I always loved the choose your own adventure books, where you'd have a book and you could make different choices. If you pick this, you flip to page 36 and continue reading, or you pick this and you turn to page 41 and you keep reading, and there's different possibilities, and they all can get you to an end point, which you hope is the Super Bowl. You hope is a deeper January run, but there are different ways to do that. For as much as you and I've spent the last 15, 20 minutes talking about wide receiver, John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta might, in addition to, signing Kevin Zeitler, they might, and Greg Roman scheming things up, maybe they figure out a way to run for 4,000 yards as opposed to 3,000 this year, and they win the Super Bowl that way, and they're laughing at all of us idiots who don't know what we're talking about. Maybe they don't have to throw the ball better, but conventional wisdom and the way the game is played today and what we've seen in January, each of the last 3 years for this football team, all would indicate they have to find a more efficient, more explosive, more productive level with their passing game. So is Sammy Watkins the guy, the answer, the number one, legitimate number one wide receiver that fans were clamoring for and pundits were saying they needed? No, he's not. And to think he would be, I think you're setting yourself up for big disappointment. Can he help, especially if he can be on the field and can maybe trim those missed games from 10 to 14? Then yeah, I think he still has some juice left, and I think he can help them in that way. But again, I will say, I think it would be a big mistake to if the brass is sitting there saying now, well, we don't really need to draft a wide receiver now. I think that would, to me, this helps you not reach. This helps you not be in a position where you take a guy when you shouldn't. But I'd have a hard time believing Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz and company are going to be sitting there over the next month in their draft meetings, not thinking that we still need to come away with a wide receiver, at least in the first two, at most 3 rounds, to add to this room. And in the meantime, hoping that Marquise Brown takes another step forward based on what he did late last year. I'm not writing off Devin Duvernay, to be very clear. I'm not going to write off James Prochet, although he's a 6th-round pick. So let's be realistic about expectations there as well. So they have young wide receivers, and that's where I think it's also fascinating to get into the discussion as far as what does this offseason look like. Will they have anything at all in the spring? I know the Players Union doesn't seem interested in having anything but virtual this spring. I know John Harbaugh, when he made some comments recently, made it clear he'd like to have at least the young guys, at least some of the rookies coming in, and maybe instead of May rookie camp, maybe it's June rookie camp, and we'll see where we are from a vaccination standpoint and cases and all of that. But there's that, and there's also, what does training camp look like? Do you have a normal preseason? I mean, all these guys that I just mentioned, these young wide receivers, they didn't have a preseason. They didn't. Some of these guys that made their NFL debut and some of these guys they called up from the practice squad later in the season, not at wide receiver, but other positions, that was their first time playing in any kind of an NFL game. They never played in a preseason schedule last summer. So there's a lot that goes to this. And again, I'll be clear, as much as I have focused on wide receiver, and so much of the discussion has been focused on wide receiver, and it deserves to be a big part of it, it's not the only part of it. To your point about Kevin Zeitler, to the point about bringing in T. Martin and Keith Williams, as assistant coaches. By the way, Keith Williams, someone that Sammy Watkins, worked with as a personal wide receivers coach. Also, I'd be remiss without mentioning Sammy Watkins' lone 1,000-yard season of his career, his second year. Greg Roman was the offensive coordinator in Buffalo. So there are some connections here. And I'm sure, going back to what you had asked about how the Ravens sold this, I'm guessing that was part of it. And maybe it does show that, yeah, you can be a 1,000-yard wide receiver in a Greg Roman offense. It's rare. It's not easy, but it's something that could be done. So, there are certainly elements of this signing to like, and it's a 1-year contract. If he only plays 6 games and gets hurt week 2 and is a non-factor, well, you're out $5 million.
And you pray for Devin Duvernay or, whoever else they draft.
Or Eric DeCosta tries to make a trade at the trade deadline,
Or they bring in the next Des White, right?
Yeah. Or, as I said, maybe you get lucky and you draft this year's version of Justin Jefferson, who's just a stud from day one. So, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this. And Lamar Jackson having another offseason to try to better himself and get together with some of these young guys and build that chemistry that presumably they didn't get to do a whole lot of last year for obvious reasons. So, so there's a lot to point to, as far as, not saying that all that's going to equal the kind of improvement they need, but there are a lot of variables, a lot of areas you can point to where you can harvest some improvement. And again, I'll go back to what I've said over and over. This isn't about the Ravens being 32nd in passing yards per game. They're going to rank really low in that department, but can they get up? Can they get back to where they were 2 years ago, where they were first in Football Outsiders passing efficiency? They were at least top 11 in yards per attempt, in passing attempt. Last year, they fell to middle of the pack or worse in those departments. So, they need to get back to where they were 2 years ago. And then you're hoping a little bit extra because you don't want to be in the position you were 2 years ago against the Titans in January. So, there are questions. And again, Sammy Watkins is not a guy that I'm doing cartwheels over whatsoever, but I think he can help. But more needs to be done, in the same way that Kevin Zeitler and improving the pass protection was a part of that. And what happens with Orlando Brown, or whoever's going to play the other guard position if Bradley Bozeman moves to center, what's going to happen there? So there are a lot of moving parts at work here. And young guys who haven't necessarily had a chance to realize their potential or even had a ton of opportunities. We'll see how it plays out. even with all this, even with all these questions, and anyone listening to this saying, "Wow, certain aspects of this conversation sounds overly negative," they've won 25 games the last 2 years, 26 if you count the postseason. So, as much as they might have this, if you want to call it fatal flaw in January, well, they still have an incredibly high floor that they're kind of jumping off with here. So, 3,000 rushing yards over the last 2 years each, 5.5 yards per carry. I will say I don't know how much better their running game can reasonably be than what it's been the last 2 years. So if you can't squeeze any more juice out of that, then where does it need to come from? The passing game. So that's why we spend so much time talking about that. And I guarantee you, John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta, based on the fact that they were trying to sign Juju Smith-Schuster and they were trying to sign T.Y. Hilton, and they ultimately land Sammy Watkins, they're aware. Doesn't mean that they're automatically going to solve the problem and it's going to be what it needs to be, but they're certainly aware. And to this point in the offseason, Kevin Zeitler, big thumbs up for that one, especially at the value. Sammy Watkins, it's a 1-year deal. If they had given Sammy Watkins the deal they were offering T.Y. Hilton, then I'd say, I don't know what they're doing, because that just would not have been a good investment in a guy who's had as many injuries as Watkins has had. But on a 1-year deal, we'll see what happens. And as I said, it should not change anything about where you viewed them going into the draft as far as the wide receiver position. To me, if the guy they like is there at 27, take him. If there's a guy that they love that is there at 22, and you feel you have an opportunity to move up a few spots to get him, then do it. Absolutely do it. So, or it could be a case of there's a guy you really love, but you think you could move back and add an extra pick, then do that. But get that guy. If there's someone that they really like in that part of the draft, land them, get them. As much as they've had their issues trying to land someone in via the free agency, based on what we've seen, based on the perception, then you might need to be a little more aggressive in the draft. And to Eric DeCosta's credit, as much as I have expressed skepticism in general, they have been taking more swings at wide receiver over the last couple of years, and that's something that they did not do for a long, long time. And how many times were you and I complaining about that? You need to get Joe
Well,
Flacco
deep down,
more
when you
ball.
have Joe Flacco and you won a championship and you throw the ball a lot, you can get Steve Smith to come here. You can get Owen Daniel to come here.
Yeah.
You can get Anquan Boldy. In this offense, I think they've learned that you're recruiting a Rod Tidwell is not going to be easy for them, right? Luke, it's a baseball week, right? So I'm going to let you rest up. It's opening day. Every night there's going to be a game. I know that's not very COVID-oriented, but we're going to try to get back to normal. You can find Luke at Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and everywhere the internet travels. Also, our WNST tech service brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. I'm wearing my Planet Fitness gear here, gearing up. I had Teddy on a couple of weeks ago. We're going to be having a bunch of sponsors on the other side of opening day, which is next week's opening day, which is what we do around here. Shout out to our friends at Wise Markets. We're eating better. We're going to spend less. We're going to educate everyone about nutrition and about all the Wise Markets. We once called them intelligent conversations. They're now wise conversations. On behalf of Luke, I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570. Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking wide receiver because it's what we do at Baltimore Positive.